Shalom Yeladim. I thought we could read another book together. This one is called Mr. Messy, and as you can see, this guy is really messy. Mr. Messy was the messiest person you'd ever met. He looked messy because he was messy in everything he did. You could always tell where Mr. Messy had been because he left a trail of messy fingerprints wherever he'd been. Oh yes, Mr. Messy was a messy person, messy by name and messy by nature. Mr. Messy lived in a particularly messy-looking house. The paint was peeling, the tiles were missing from the roof, the flower beds were overgrown with weeds. And had Mr. Messy cut the grass in his garden lately? No, he had not. One morning, Mr. Messy woke up in his bed, yawned and scratched, got up and cleaned his teeth, leaving the top off the toothpaste, had his breakfast, and spilled cornflakes all over the floor, and then he set out for a walk. Unfortunately, he tripped over something he left in the garden weeks before. Maybe he should have cleaned up. There was a wood behind Mr. Messy's messy house with the messy garden, and that's where he went for his walk. It was a particularly large wood with lots and lots of trees, and it took Mr. Messy a long time to walk through it, but he didn't really mind because he felt like walking that morning. So he walked and walked right outside the wood until he came to the other side, and do you know what he found on the other side of the wood? Can anyone guess? Mr. Messy found the neatest, prettiest looking little cottage he'd ever seen. It had a lovely little garden with a stream running through it. A cottage is a kind of house. There was a man in the garden who was cleaning it up. He looked up as Mr. Messy approached. "Good morning. I'm Mr. Messy," said Mr. Messy. "I can see that," said the man, looking up at him up and down. "I'm Mr. Tidy." That's another word for being clean. "And I'm Mr. Neat," said another man, appearing out of the house. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. "We're in this business together," said Mr. Tidy, "and the people who own the house have asked us to do some work for them." "What sort of work?" said Mr. Messy. "Oh, we make things nice and neat," said Mr. Neat. "We tidy things up," said Mr. Tidy. "Perhaps we could come along and do some work for you," said Mr. Neat, looking at Mr. Messy, who was looking even messier than usual that particular morning. "But I don't want things neat and tidy," said Mr. Messy, looking downright miserable at the thought of it. There's Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy. "Nonsense," said Mr. Tidy. "Fiddlesticks," said Mr. Neat. "But," said Mr. Messy. "Come along," said Mr. Neat. "Off we go." But, said Mr. Messy. "But nothing," said Mr. Neat, and they bundled him into their van, which was parked behind the house. Off they went to Mr. Messy's house at the other side of the wood. You see, there's their truck, the Neat and Tidy truck. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat when he saw where Mr. Messy lived. "Good gracious me," added Mr. Tidy. "This is the messiest house I've ever seen in all my born days," they said. "Better do something about it," said Mr. Neat. And before Mr. Messy could open his mouth, the two of them were rushing here and rushing about Mr. Messy's house. Mr. Neat hoed and mowed, pruned and snipped, and cleared and dug, and made the garden look neater than it ever had looked before. Mr. Tidy cleaned and primed, and rubbed and painted and mended, and made the outside of Mr. Messy's house look tidier than it ever had before. Then they both went inside the house. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat for the second time that morning. "Good gracious," said Mr. Tidy for the second time that morning. And then they set about cleaning the house from top to bottom. They brushed and swept, polished and scrubbed, and made the inside of the house look neater and tidier than it ever had before. "There we are," said Mr. Tidy. "All finished," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. Mr. Messy just didn't know what to say. Then they both looked at Mr. Messy. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" said Mr. Neat to Mr. Tidy. "Precisely," said Mr. Tidy. What we're both thinking, they said together to Mr. Messy, is that you look too messy to live in a neat and tidy house like this. But, said Mr. Messy. Did Mr. Messy look happy or sad? I don't know. But whatever Mr. Messy said was of no use. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy whisked him off to the bathroom upstairs. It had been the messiest room in the house, but now, of course, it was neat as a pin. Then Mr. Neat got hold of one of Mr. Messy's arms, and Mr. Tidy got hold of the other one, and they picked him up, put him straight into the bath. Mr. Messy wasn't used to having baths. I don't think he likes it. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy washed and brushed, cleaned and scrubbed and combed Mr. Messy until he didn't look like Mr. Messy at all. In fact, he looked the opposite of messy. He looked at himself in the mirror. "You know what I'm going to have to do now," he said in a rather fierce voice. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy looked worried. This is a very different Mr. Messy than we're used to seeing, right? "What are you going to have to do?" they asked Mr. Messy. "I'm going to have to change my name," said Mr. Messy, and he smiled. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy laughed, and then they all laughed together, and they became the best of friends. And that really is the end of the story, except to say that if you're a messy sort of person, you might get a visit from two friends. Yeladi, sometimes we get a little bit messy, and sometimes we like to be cleaned up. But either way, we all love each other and we're all friends.